oil. All along northern Africa still remained the rusted hulks of tanks and armored vehicles that clashed in the massive battles, all in a bid to starve the Allies of precious oil. But this world war didn't just include European players. Japan invited itself to the chat, and its ambition to rule the Pacific put it on a collision course with the allied European powers who still maintained very lucrative colonies in the region. These colonies produced everything from food to all-important rubber to, once more, oil. And Japan just didn't want these resources for itself, it needed them. As an island nation, Japan is relatively resource poor and depends on importing vital resources from other nations. This meant that the West would always have a leash on Japan, preventing it from rising as a major power by keeping its ambitions in check via threatening trade embargoes. The launch of hostilities in Europe was the opportunity Japan needed to take these lucrative colonies for itself, then kick the West out of the Pacific and establish the empire of the rising sun over Asia. Japan had already launched an invasion of China, which itself had been preoccupied with bitter infighting between the nationalists and the communists. These two sides temporarily set their differences aside and tried to repel the Japanese invaders, but Japan was better equipped and trained than the disheveled Chinese forces. China had, after all, just endured a century of humiliation where it was purposefully weakened and exploited by European powers. Despite absolutely dwarfing Japan, it was in no position to resist imperial Japanese forces. China would provide much of the raw materials and manufacturing power that Japan needed to fuel its empire. But there was still one Western power who could ruin all of Japan's ambitions, the United States of America. The U.S. had maintained a strong Pacific presence for decades due to the area's importance to international trade. Despite being the world's fourth largest country, the U.S. had always been a maritime power. And that's because of its unique position on the face of the Earth. It is the most important nation between the Atlantic and the Pacific, making it a balancing point between Europe and Asian powers. But U.S. national security strategy hinged on being a powerful maritime power, and the nation was committed to tolerating zero incursion into its hemisphere of the Earth from any other major power, European or Asian. By the time that Second World War rolled around, the United States Navy was rivaling the vaunted Royal Navy, with the express purpose of ensuring that conflict was always far from home. Much of this firepower was stationed in the Pacific, where the United States was keeping a very close eye on Japan. Japanese expansionism had seriously disrupted U.S. trade in the region, and relations between the two powers were strained at best. The U.S. held a superior strategic position, with its forces capable of defending all important Pacific rubber plantations and oil fields. Japan was heavily reliant on American oil and industrial exports, and as long as this remained the status quo, the U.S. would always hold the leash on Japanese ascension. Thus, in December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy struck Pearl Harbor in a bid to inflict catastrophic losses on the U.S. Navy and keep it out of the Pacific for good. At the same time, it launched an invasion of the American-held Philippines, looking to ensure the U.S. had no base of operations in the region from which to counterattack. The addition of the Pacific Theater had just made the Second World War the truly first global conflict, and now fighting raged across the entire face of the planet. In the Pacific alone, it's estimated there were about 25 million casualties, more than total casualties for World War I. Only 6 million of those casualties were combatants. The rest, a whopping 19 million, were civilians. While both sides targeted civilians, with the Chinese and allies inflicting an estimated 1.2 million civilian casualties on Japan, the Japanese Empire killed Chinese civilians for sport, much like Russia in Ukraine today. Most of the civilian casualties were Chinese, with between 7 and 8 million killed by the Japanese in mass slaughters, indiscriminate bombardments, or just falling prey to the ravages of war itself. An estimated 200,000 Chinese civilians were killed over 6 weeks in Nanjing alone, as the Japanese army turned killing into a contest. The addition of the entire new theater of war skyrocketed the total casualties for the Second World War. But technology would also turn this into the bloodiest conflict in human history. At the onset of World War I, the airplane was a curiosity that most military commanders didn't quite know how to deploy. They knew it could make for a handy scout, though, and thus it replaced observation balloons in both armies, giving commanders a true bird's-eye view of enemy positions for the first time. Information is power, though, and soon both armies started trying to shoot each other's planes out of the sky. The first aerial duels took place with pistols and achieved very little, but soon machine guns were being loaded on airplanes as their engines became increasingly powerful. Some enterprising minds saw the potential of the airplane for directly attacking enemy positions from the air, though, and while machine guns were nice, if you really wanted to have an impact on the front, you needed to deliver mass death from the sky. Airplane engines were still pretty weak, so the first aerial bombardment weapons were sharpened darts, carried aloft by the hundreds and dropped over the front. These sharp darts would fall from a great distance, and if they scored a hit, could be lethal for a soldier, creating a deep, wide wound that was impossible to stop bleeding. However, the darts were inaccurate, and very few of them actually ever found a target. If a dart missed, like most did, it presented little more than a tripping hazard for enemy soldiers. Grenades were soon being chucked out of the open cockpits of airplanes, but engineers dreamt of more, bigger airplanes capable of carrying much more bombs, enough to have a significant impact on enemy units. The first bombers could only carry between 55 and 120 pounds of bombs. But soon, aircraft like the Russian Ilyich Voronezh could carry as much as 1,500 pounds of bombs. The future was clear. Airplanes would become the most important weapons of the next World War. When World War II broke out, Hitler's armies made excellent use of fighter and bomber aircraft as part of their blitzkrieg, or lightning warfare. Pummeling enemy defenses from the air before the ground forces arrived helped soften them up for a ground attack. In the Pacific, Imperial Japan proved the age of the battleship was at an end when it nearly succeeded in defeating the United States of America in a single strike with aircraft launched via carriers. The airplane allowed massive bomb loads to be carried hundreds or even thousands of miles, and in numbers, planes could put entire cities under siege. Today, the accepted way of fighting a modern war is to engage enemy troops and destroy military and economically important targets. Civilian populations are off limits, and it's no longer acceptable to target them purposefully as part of your strategy to defeat the enemy. In World War II, the mass killing of civilians was the strategy for defeating. If the civilian population could be eradicated, the economic force would make it difficult and impossible to continue prosecuting the war. These killing civilians also demoralized the enemy, prompting nations to seek peace. Thus, in World War II, the targeting of cities was not just their goal, but it success. In the First World War, civilian deaths numbered around 10 million. In the Second World War, civilian deaths were twice as high as military deaths, at around 50 to 55 million. And the airplane made much more of that slaughter possible. During World War I, the artillery piece was the upper limit of how far one could threaten them, typical over a few months. With most fighting in World War I outside of operation centers, this puts civilians at low risk from direct combat deaths, with many of the deaths occurring due to the follow-on effects of the war, namely starvation and disease. However, in the Second World War, airplanes could threaten cities anywhere near Europe or even further, and they could bring with them thousands of pounds of bombs, with armed formations sometimes bringing the hundreds. Indiscriminate bombing campaigns leveled entire cities, but special types of bombs made the killing much more efficient. Often cities were targeted with incendiary munitions or bombs designed to create little blast damage and instead fuel massive firestorms. The German city of Dresden was one of the victims of World War II firebombing and turned the entire city into a concrete skeleton covered in ash. Incredibly, the city was reduced nearly to rubble in just 3 days, with 3,900 tons of explosives and incendiary devices dropped on.
Zojuist bij thuiskomst kwamen de emoties eigenlijk gelijk naar boven. De gedachte dat ik weer de hele week alleen zal zijn. Ik had niet verwacht dat het zo zwaar zou zijn.
Deze 3 studenten hebben maar één doel. Piloot worden.
Ik heb geen plan B. Ik ga even vol voor mijn droom is piloot worden.
Zijn ze bereid om alles op te geven voor die ene droom?
Ik denk dat het heel erg wennen is om mijn gezin niet meer te kunnen zien.
Ik voel wel een enorme druk om te presteren.
Als ik het heb doorgesteld, dan ga ik daar 100% voor.
Dit is Pilotendroom.
This is your captain, Joël.
De opleiding is van start gegaan en dat betekent dat ze hun oude leven gedag kunnen zeggen. Joëlle neemt afscheid van haar bijbaan waar ze met liefde werkt, zodat ze zich volledig kan focussen op haar studie.
Ik werk bij dierenpensioen. Dan ben ik altijd in dit geval dan als mensen op vakantie gaan. Dit is voor mij echt de ideale bijbaan omdat ik gewoon super erg van dieren hou. En ik vind het gewoon heel leuk om omringd te
On the city by the British Royal Air Force. Such massive devastation in such a short period of time was unheard of in World War I and would have surely shaken both Allied and Central Power commanders to the core. But in the Second World War, the deaths of 25,000 civilians in 3 days was just par for the course. In the Pacific Theater, though, air raids on civilian cities reached new catastrophic heights. While more civilians died in Europe, Japanese civilians were particularly vulnerable to air raids by the time that the strategic bombing campaign of Japan began in 1944. With Japan refusing to surrender, the Allies began to plan an invasion of the Japanese islands to weaken Japan for the coming invasion and to attempt to convince the stubborn Japanese into surrender before such an invasion. Unrestricted bombing of the Japanese islands was approved. First air raids took place against military and industrial targets. However, major Japanese industrial centers were quickly reduced to rubble. By now, Japanese forces were so starved of fuel, trained pilots, and planes that they couldn't mount much, if any, resistance against air raids. Anti-aircraft on the ground were nearly useless, as they had difficulty reaching the high-flying American B-29s. With the loss of major industrial centers, the Japanese dispersed their industrial efforts across their cities to homes and small workshops. This made them much harder to target and neutralize, which prompted the approval of mass bombings of the civilian population. Japanese cities were not just poorly defended from the air, but were particularly vulnerable to bombing. Very quickly on, the United States realized that using conventional high explosives was not very effective against Japanese cities, due to the fact that most buildings were constructed out of wood. High explosives were designed to destroy British and Northern European cities, but Japanese cities were much more vulnerable to incendiary devices. Thus, U.S. bombers began to launch incendiary devices by the thousands over Japanese cities, sparking massive firestorms that razed cities nearly entirely. It wasn't just the massive volume of bombing carried out by the U.S., but also poor organization of civil defense that led to the massive destruction of Japanese cities and loss of life. Bomb shelters had never been created in large numbers in Japan, and it's unlikely the nation ever believed it would be subjected to the same massive bombing it was carrying out against Chinese cities. Without bomb shelters, civilians had nowhere to shelter from the flames that spanned entire cities, and they were incinerated in the streets. But Japanese firefighters were also poorly trained and equipped for combating blazes, and this led to the fire raging completely out of control with no hope of stopping. People may remember the nuclear bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but massive aerial campaigns had so blocked the killings of atomic bombs that when news of the total casualties for the bombings reached Imperial Japanese command, they were mostly unperturbed. It was only the realization that a single bomb had caused so much devastation they gave them any pause. On the ground, the development of mobile warfare also helped fuel the massive casualties of World War II. Before World War II, troops moved largely on foot, and this limited both the speed and scope of an advance. Forces couldn't spread out as widely or move as quickly as when warfare became mechanized. The marriage between tanks and mechanized infantry allowed warfare to become much faster, covering much more ground. This in turn meant that more territory could be covered, spreading the scope of the fighting and putting more civilian populations at risk. And nowhere did mobile warfare have a dramatic impact as in Eastern Europe. In the First World War, Russia was defeated relatively early, and the German army did require an invasion to force its exit. The violence resulted in an estimated 8 to 10 million dead, with many more of that number wounded. In the Second World War, the Eastern Front saw a staggering 40 million dead, about 4 times World War I's figures. The invasion of Russia opened up an entire new front of the war that had been very limited in the First World War, and Hitler's brutal push to Moscow ended up making it the deadliest theater of the war. But Hitler was also busy pumping up his numbers by engaging in one of the greatest atrocities in human history. Hitler dreamt of a pure Europe, one free of any race but the Aryan race, with perhaps a token number of survivors of other races to be used as slave labor. To make his sick fantasy a reality, he initiated wholesale industrial slaughter of anyone he deemed undesirable. To make his list, one only needed to be of another race or an undesirable political ideology, or be disabled. Hitler's dreams of a pure Third Reich left no room for anyone who wasn't whole in body and mind, prompting the mass slaughter of individuals with special needs. The best-known victims of the Holocaust are the Jewish people, who suffered between 5 and 6 million of their number killed in concentration camps and mass slaughters across Germany and occupied territories. As the German army conquered new lands, they began the systemic removal of all undesirables, putting them into ghettos where they were quarantined until transportation could be arranged to either work camps where they would live as slave labor or extermination camps. While inside cramped ghettos, they would be walled off from the outside world by barbed wire, armed guards, and often